Most people believe that earning more will eventually solve their financial problems. It will not. The pattern that keeps wealth away from most people was never about income, it was about identity. Solomon observed this thousands of years ago and encoded it into a single verse that most people have read without ever understanding what it was actually measuring. There is a behavioral filter operating beneath every financial decision you make, and if your patterns do not qualify, no amount of income will change what you accumulate. What you call financial struggle may not be circumstance. It may be inherited. Tell me in the comments, were you ever taught this about money? There is a man who earns more this year than he did last year. He earns more than he did the year before that. Each raise arrives. Each promotion lands. And yet, at the end of every month, the number in his account looks almost identical to what it was 12 months ago. Not because he is reckless, not because he is careless. He would tell you himself, he works hard. He is not the kind of person who wastes money on obvious things. He pays his bills. He saves what he can. He believes, genuinely believes, that the next level of income will be the one that changes everything. It does not. This is not a story about laziness. This is not a lecture about budgeting. What we are examining today is something older, something quieter, and something far more precise than any financial advice you have likely heard before. There is a pattern that repeats itself across generations, not because of bad luck, not because of a broken system, but because of something that was inherited not in the form of money, but in the form of behavior, of response, of identity. And until that pattern is seen clearly, income alone will never produce stability. The modern belief about wealth is built on one assumption, that more earning leads to more accumulation. It sounds logical. It is taught everywhere, in schools, in workplaces, in the culture that surrounds daily life. Work harder, earn more, repeat. The idea is that wealth is a reward distributed to those who produce enough. Watch what actually happens. A professional receives a salary increase. Within weeks, the apartment is upgraded. The car changes, the dining changes, the clothing changes, the clothing changes. Each of these decisions feels justified because the income is now higher. The lifestyle expands to meet the new number and then slightly beyond it. Within a year, the same financial pressure exists at a higher income level. The cycle has not broken. It has simply scaled upward. This is not a failure of intelligence. The person making these decisions is often educated, often strategic in their professional life, often thoughtful in other areas. But in the area of wealth, a specific pattern is operating beneath conscious awareness. The system that surrounds us is designed to reward visible earning. Promotions, bonuses, titles, these are measured and celebrated. But the system remains almost completely silent about preservation, about what happens after the money arrives, about the behavior that determines whether what was earned is retained, multiplied, or dissolved. This silence is not accidental, but more importantly, it is not new. The ancient world understood something about wealth that the modern world has largely discarded, not because the knowledge was lost, but because it became inconvenient, because it required something that urgency and consumption cannot coexist with: discipline. In the book of Proverbs, in the 13th chapter, in the 22nd verse, a statement is made with a precision that no financial model has yet improved upon. A good man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. Read that carefully. Not for his children, for his children's children. The framework embedded in that single sentence is not about income. It is not about generosity in the common sense. It is about a specific type of person described as good whose relationship with resources is stable enough, structured enough, and long-term enough to produce continuity across multiple generations. Solomon, who authored much of Proverbs, was not speaking abstractly. He was describing a system, a pattern of behavior that, when followed consistently, produces an outcome that transcends a single lifetime. Inheritance, in this ancient framework, is not an event. It is not what happens when someone passes away and leaves behind an amount. Inheritance, properly understood, is a system of continuity. It is the result of discipline compounded across time, passed forward not only as currency, but as the capacity to preserve currency. The ancient merchant did not display his wealth. He did not announce his increase. When his resources grew, the first response was not acquisition, it was consolidation, protection, quiet structure. He understood something that the modern earner does not: that wealth observed by the wrong eyes invites the wrong forces. That celebration of increase often precedes its erosion. Lineage thinking is not the same as monthly thinking. A man thinking in months asks, "What can I afford now?" A man thinking in generations asks, "What structure am I building that will outlast my decisions?" These are not the same question. They do not produce the same outcomes. Now comes the moment where a fundamental assumption must be examined. The assumption is this: that financial struggle is primarily caused by lack of opportunity. This assumption is nearly universal, and it is the reason most people never locate the actual source of their financial pattern. Because if the cause is external, if the obstacle is the system, the environment, the economy, then the solution must also be external. More income, more opportunity, more access. But consider what happens when that access arrives. The lottery winner who returns to financial difficulty within years. The professional athlete whose earnings over a career exceed what most families accumulate in 3 generations. Yet, who retires with almost nothing preserved. The salaried employee whose income doubles over a decade, but whose net stability barely shifts. These are not isolated anomalies. They are the same pattern, repeated at different income levels. This is what can be called poverty DNA, and the name is deliberately precise. Not poverty as a circumstance, but poverty as an inherited set of behavioral patterns, response patterns, decision patterns, emotional reflexes that were absorbed, not chosen, observed in childhood, practiced through repetition, normalized into identity, the urgency to spend when money arrives, the emotional relief that comes from acquisition, the discomfort of holding resources without immediately acting on them, the instinct to celebrate visible progress rather than protect invisible structure. These are learned responses. They are generational, and they operate below the level of conscious decision. The merchants. Son grew up watching his father pause before every significant decision, watching silence be treated as an asset, watching restraint honored as a form of intelligence. That observation became instinct. It became identity. The impatient earner grew up watching money arrive and immediately disappear, watching urgency treated as necessary, watching survival logic applied to every financial moment regardless of whether survival was actually at stake. That, too, became identity. Neither inheritance began as a choice. Both became automatic. The question is not whether you recognize the pattern. The question is whether you are willing to examine which one has been operating inside your financial decisions, not for the past month, but across your entire relationship with money. What governs whether wealth enters and remains in a life is not effort. It is not ambition. It is something more precise and far more ancient. It can be called the inheritance gate code. This is not a motivational concept. It is not a strategy. It is a description of how wealth actually behaves, how it selects, what it requires, and why it departs from environments that cannot sustain it. Think of it as a filter, not a reward system, not a punishment, a filter. Wealth, across every ancient tradition that studied it carefully, was understood to be selective, not in a mystical sense, but in a behavioral sense. Resources, when they arrive in an environment of volatility, erode. When they arrive in an environment of structure, they compound. This is not philosophy. It is observed pattern, repeated across generations, across cultures, across centuries. The inheritance gate code operates through 3 specific signals. The first is restraint. The second is silence. The third is consistency. Restraint is not denial. It is not deprivation. Restraint is a discipline of not responding to money with emotion. It is the pause between receiving and acting. It is the space where decision replaces reflex. When unexpected income arrives and the first response is stillness, not excitement. Not immediate deployment, not celebration, that is the first signal. That pause communicates something specific. This person can be trusted with more, because they do not dissolve what they are given. Silence is protection. In the ancient world, the merchant who spoke openly about his resources invited negotiation, expectation, and pressure. The family that displayed its increase attracted those who would consume it. Silence was not secretive, it was structural. It maintained the conditions under which growth could continue undisturbed. In the modern world, the pressure to display financial progress is constant and loud. The impulse to signal status, to announce milestones, to make visible what has been earned, this impulse is one of the most reliable mechanisms for disrupting accumulation. What is not seen cannot be claimed. Consistency is the signal that most people underestimate, and the one the filter weighs most heavily. Anyone can practice restraint once. Anyone can remain silent about a single financial gain. But to maintain structured behavior across time, across months, without visible results? Across periods where discipline produces no immediate reward. This is the signal that separates those who accumulate from those who cycle. Consistency is the proof that the behavior is identity, not performance. There are 2 types of people who engage with money. They are not defined by income. They are not defined by education, background, or circumstance. They are defined by orientation. The earner is acquisition-focused. The measure of success is how much comes in. The earner's identity is built around production, around proving capability through visible output. There is nothing contemptible about this. The earner works hard, often sacrificially, often with genuine discipline in the area of effort. But the earner's relationship with money ends at arrival. What happens after the money lands is not governed by structure, it is governed by reaction. The preserver is control-focused. The measure of success is not what arrives, but what remains. The preserver does not experience money as a reward to be enjoyed. They experience it as a resource to be deployed carefully and protected deliberately. The preserver is not always the highest earner in the room. They are frequently not, but across time, they are the ones around whom stability forms and compounds. One works for money, the other is trusted with it. This is not a moral judgment. It is a structural observation. Wealth does not flow toward effort alone. It accumulates in environments where it is preserved, and preservation is not a behavior. It is an identity, a way of seeing, a way of being in relationship with resources. The question that follows from this is direct. When money arrives at any amount, in any form, what is your first response? Is it movement? Is it relief? Is it excitement? Or is it stillness? That response tells you more about your financial trajectory than any income figure ever will. You do not rise into wealth. You align with it, and alignment begins not with what you earn, but with what you are prepared to become. There is something that disciplined families understand that almost no one speaks about openly. When income increases, they do not celebrate. Not because they are cold, not because they are ungrateful, but because they have learned through observation, through generational pattern, through quiet instruction, that visible excitement about financial progress is one of the most reliable ways to disrupt it. This will sound unusual to most people. In a culture that treats celebration as obligatory, that frames financial milestones as moments to be announced and shared, the idea that silence is the appropriate response to increase feels almost counterintuitive. But examine it carefully. When a household announces its progress, when the new car arrives, when the vacation is posted, when the renovation is displayed, several things happen simultaneously. Expectations shift in the surrounding environment. Requests increase. Pressure to maintain the visible standard mounts. And internally, something more subtle occurs. The emotional reward of the display replaces the structural reward of the growth. The feeling of having succeeded substitutes for the discipline of continuing to build. The celebration becomes the destination. And once a destination is reached, forward movement slows. The disciplined family does not make the celebration the destination. The increase is acknowledged internally, quietly, and then immediately redirected into structure. The question is never, how do we enjoy this? The question is, where does this belong? What does this protect? What does this build? That reorientation is not natural for most people. It must be practiced. It must become reflex. And it begins with understanding the second structural layer of the inheritance gate code. If restraint is the first signal, structured preservation is the second. Restraint keeps money from being spent emotionally. But restraint alone is not sufficient. Money that is not spent still requires direction. Without structure, resources that are preserved in one moment are simply preserved for the next emotional impulse. The pause must lead somewhere. It must lead into a system. Structured preservation is the practice of allocating resources into fixed categories before any discretionary decision is made. Not a budget in the modern, reactive sense, not a list of expenses tracked after the fact. A predetermined structure that resources enter before any other decision is possible. The ancient household operated on this principle without naming it. A portion was set aside before the household consumed. A portion was protected before any investment was considered. A portion was held without designation, without a plan, without a purpose other than continuity. The structure was not flexible according to emotion. It was fixed. It was non-negotiable in the same way that certain physical laws are non-negotiable. The modern earner treats allocation as optional, as something that happens with what is left over after the month completes. This inversion, structure after consumption rather than structure before, is one of the primary mechanisms through which income fails to become wealth. Consider two individuals receiving identical monthly income. Their first responds to income arrival with immediate decision. Bills are paid as they are remembered. Purchases are made as they feel appropriate. Savings, if any, receive what remains at the end of the cycle. The structure, such as it is reactive. It bends to mood, to circumstance, to social pressure, to opportunity. At the end of 12 months, the financial position is moved, but not in a direction governed by intention. The second responds to income arrival with a predetermined sequence. Before any discretionary decision is made, resources are moved into fixed allocations, not elaborate, not complex, fixed ratios, quietly maintained, regardless of what the month brings emotionally. Celebrations do not alter them. Difficulties do not suspend them. The structure holds because the structure is identity, not a strategy to be applied when convenient. At the end of 12 months, the second individual has not necessarily earned more. They may have experienced the same pressures, the same unexpected expenses, the same social demands, but they have built something the first individual has not. Predictability. And predictability, in the language of ancient wealth, is the truest form of readiness. Wealth avoids volatility. This is the hidden leva. This is the structural insight that most financial teaching never reaches, because it cannot be packaged into urgency. It cannot be sold as a 30-day transformation. It requires something that the modern environment is specifically designed to prevent: extended patience without visible reward, volatile behavior, emotional decisions, inconsistent structure, reactive spending. Impulsive generosity followed by impulsive restriction signals risk and resources, whether we speak of them in human terms or in the older language of stewardship and trust, do not compound in environments of risk. They erode. Stability is not boring. In the ancient framework, stability was the highest financial virtue. The merchant whose decisions were predictable across seasons was the merchant whom others trusted with capital. The household whose allocation ratios did not shift with mood was the household that lenders approached without hesitation. The individual whose behavior was consistent across time, not just in prosperous periods, but in lean ones, not just when observed, but when alone, was the individual whom increase could safely enter. Because increase, at scale, requires a container, and a volatile life is not a container, it is a sieve. This is why the discipline test is not administered in moments of abundance. Anyone can maintain structure when resources are flowing freely and social conditions are comfortable. The test is administered in the quiet, unremarkable months. In the periods where the structure produces no visible result, where the allocation continues and nothing appears to change, where the practice asks for continuation without offering confirmation. Most people abandon structure precisely here, not because they lack intelligence, not because they do not understand the principle, but because the emotional architecture of urgency, the inherited reflex to respond, to adjust, to act, cannot tolerate extended stillness without interpreting it as failure. Those who endure that stillness without abandoning the structure are not simply patient. They are demonstrating something specific, that their behavior is not dependent on external validation, that their discipline is internal, that they have separated identity from outcome. This is what wealth observes. This is what the filter measures. The shift from monthly thinking to generational thinking is not a philosophical exercise. It is a practical reorientation of every financial decision. The monthly mind asks, what do I need now? What can I afford this cycle? What will make this period more comfortable? The generational mind asks different questions entirely. It asks, what am I building that will exist beyond this decision? What pattern am I establishing that my circumstances will reflect 5 years from now? What does this choice communicate about the kind of environment I am creating, not just for myself, but for those who will inherit the result of my consistency? This reorientation does not require large income. It does not require existing wealth. It requires only a change in the time horizon against which decisions are measured. A small, consistent allocation made monthly for a decade is not primarily about the amount accumulated, it is about the identity that 10 years of consistency constructs. It is about the behavioral signal that a decade of structure sends to the environment, to those observing, and most importantly, to the internal architecture that governs future decisions. The man who has been consistent for 10 years does not approach a significant financial decision the way the reactive earner does. His instincts have been reorganized. His reflex is no longer urgency, it is evaluation. His first response to financial pressure is not emotion, it is structure. He does not need to discipline himself in the moment because discipline has become the default. This is the transformation that ancient wealth teaching points toward. Not a change in circumstance, a change in nature. There is a cultural pressure that must be named clearly because it operates as one of the most persistent disruption forces against structured accumulation. It is the pressure of visible performance. The social environment surrounding most people rewards display. It rewards the visible signal of progress, the upgraded possession, the announced milestone, the demonstrated status. And it punishes, quietly, but consistently, those who do not participate in this performance. The individual who does not upgrade, who does not display, who accumulates in silence is often perceived as either unsuccessful or withholding. This pressure is not neutral. It is a consuming force. And every time it is submitted to, every time structure is broken to maintain a social appearance, the accumulation is disrupted and the signal to the filter is reset. Silence is not poverty. Silence is protection. The person who understands this does not experience social pressure as an inconvenience to be managed. They experience it as a test, the same test that consistency represents. Can the structure hold when the environment demands performance? Can the identity remain intact when visibility is treated as currency? Those who answer yes to these questions, consistently, over time, are not simply disciplined. They are qualified. Constant movement is not the same as progress. The anti-Husserl position, properly understood, is not an argument for passivity. It is a recognition that undirected activity, busyness without structural intent, produces the sensation of progress without its substance. The individual who is always reacting, always pursuing, always in motion, often ends decades of effort in a financial position that reflects none of that energy. Fewer decisions, made with greater deliberation, produce more stable outcomes than many decisions made with urgency. The controlled choice, the one that is delayed until the structure has been consulted, until emotion has been removed, until the generational question has been asked, carries more weight than 100 impulsive responses to opportunity. Stillness is not absence of intelligence. Stillness is where structure speaks. The daily practice that supports all of this is not complex. It does not require systems or tools. It requires only a nightly habit of quiet evaluation. Before the day closes, before attention moves toward rest, a brief, unemotional review, not a celebration of what went well, not a punishment for what went poorly. A clear, honest examination of three things: where resources moved, whether that movement was structural or reactive, and what the following day's one financial decision, if any, should be. This practice, done consistently, without drama, without expectation of immediate transformation, begins to build something invisible and permanent. It builds financial self-awareness that is not emotional. It builds the reflex of evaluation before action. It builds the daily proof, compounding across time, that discipline is not occasional. It is identity. Small daily control builds invisible structure. An invisible structure, across years, produces visible inheritance. Return now to the ancient text. A good man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. The word that matters most in that sentence is not inheritance. It is not children. It is good. In the ancient framework, goodness was not primarily a moral category. It was a behavioral description. A good man was a structurally sound man, a man whose patterns were reliable, whose restraint was consistent, whose decisions were governed by long-term orientation rather than short-term relief. A man who had aligned his identity with the requirements of preservation. Wealth remains where discipline can keep it. This is not a promise that effort will be rewarded. It is not a guarantee of any outcome. It is an observation, ancient, consistent, undecorated, about the relationship between behavioral identity and financial continuity. Those whose patterns repel stability will cycle regardless of income. Those whose patterns invite stability will accumulate regardless of circumstance. The question has never been how much you earn. The question is whether what you are, in behavior, in response, in the daily quiet of your financial decisions, is the kind of identity that wealth can trust. You do not chase inheritance. You become what inheritance follows. And that becoming does not begin with the next raise, the next opportunity, or the next financial season. It begins tonight. If this reframed how you think about money, not just what you do with it, leave a comment below. Subscribe for the next study in ancient wealth identity. Share this with one person whose thinking is ready to shift.